I hope you're ready for a great treat tonight. I have the great pleasure of introducing you to our speaker today, Martin Cherry, librarian at the Museum of Freemasonry. And Martin will take us through some of the great Yorkshire treasures we have in the museum collection. And we're looking so much forward to this, Martin. I will hand over to you now.
Hello, everyone. In 2012, I was invited to Yorkshire to give a talk to the Grand Officers' Mess of the Provincial Grand Lodge of Yorkshire, North and East Ridings, which to a non-Mason from London sounded like a pretty daunting prospect. Ever the coward, I decided to play to the home crowd and talked about some of the Yorkshire treasures in our collection. I needn't have worried, the Yorkshire Freemasons were lovely, liked the talk and asked good questions. Looking back, I realised that the talk was a good way of highlighting different aspects of our collections and could appeal to a wider audience, which I guess we're about to find out. It's also Yorkshire Day on the 1st of August, so the timing's right. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to introduce 4 treasures that encompass 4 centuries of Freemasonry. 2 are museum objects. 1 belonged to a tragic prince, and 1 belonged to a sporting hero. A treasure from our archives takes us from 17th century stonemasons to 19th century collectors. Even the library gets a look in a book from the time when York had its own Grand Lodge. Each item has a tale to tell, but first, a little bit of Yorkshire Freemasonry. The original Grand Lodge of England, formed in London in 1717, established the first Yorkshire Lodge in Scarborough in 1729, although it stopped meeting by 1753. They had more luck with a lodge at the Black Bull in Halifax, which has been meeting continuously since 1738 and is now called the Lodge of Probity No. 61 of the United Grand Lodge of England. In this early period, the city of York was doing its own thing, but I'll come to that later. For any viewers unfamiliar with Freemasonry's terminology, lodges are the basic unit of Freemasonry, but refer to a group of Freemasons rather than a building. Grand Lodges, ruled by a Grand Master, are the governing body of Freemasonry, often in a particular geographical area. These can be whole countries, such as the United Grand Lodge of England, or areas within countries, such as the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. Sometimes more than one Grand Lodge exists in an area. After the creation of the Lodge at the Black Bull in 1738, the Grand Lodge of England made William Houghton the first provincial Grand Master of the West Riding of Yorkshire. English Freemasonry is the second level of hierarchy under Grand Lodges, called provincial Grand Lodges, which mostly tie up to the old traditional counties. Houghton's successor in 1740, Edward Rooks Leeds, was given the whole county. Subsequent provincial Grand Masters struggled to cover such a vast area, and in 1817 the province was divided into 2, Yorkshire West Riding and Yorkshire North and East Ridings. The provinces are still going strong, with nearly 300 lodges and 9,000 plus members between them. They've also provided the United Grand Lodge of England with 3 Grand Masters. The Earl of Zetland on the left was Grand Master from 1843 to 1870, the Marquis of Ripon in the centre, Grand Master from 1870 to 74, and the Earl of Harewood on the right was Grand Master from 42 to 47. But enough history, let's get on with the treasures. Treasure number 1 is this really elaborate Founder's Jewel for Albert Victor Lodge number 2328 in York. As the name suggests, these jewels were worn by Freemasons who found a new lodge and usually feature the badge or coat of arms of the lodge. This one was manufactured by the Regalia Company, George Kenning & Son, and is made of 18-karat gold and enamel. The hanging device is the coat of arms of Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, surmounted by the crest of his father, Albert Edward, Prince of Wales. In place of a ribbon, it hangs from a gold fretwork in 5 rows, each featuring 5 white roses, representing both Yorkshire and the 25 members of the lodge, who presented the jewel to its owner in 1891. The jewel comes in a black leather case with crimson silk and velvet lining, and has the Prince of Wales's crest on the lid in silver and enamel. If you turn the jewel over, it has a Latin inscription on the back, which translates, "To our illustrious brother and founder, Albert Victor Christian Edward, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, KG, Provincial Grand Master of Berkshire, the 25 brethren of the Lodge, Yorkshiremen grateful and loyal, present this offering, 27th of January, 1891. Prince Albert Victor, on the right, had a brief but active spell in Freemasonry. He was initiated in Royal Alpha Lodge, London, in 1885, and was its master by 1889, when the Albert Victor Lodge was founded. Unusually, his second degree ceremony took place in the Lodge of Friendship in Great Yarmouth, and third degree in Isaac Newton Lodge, Cambridge. His father, Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England, appointed him Senior Grand Warden in 1887, and Provincial Grand Master of Berkshire in 1890, which is the regalia he's wearing in this photograph, but wasn't when it was taken. Here's the original. Albert Victor, with his uncle, the Duke of Connaught, and his father, the future King Edward VII, outside Brighton Pavilion in 1886, when young Albert was still only an entered apprentice. In Freemasonry, every new member has to go through 3 symbolic ceremonies called degrees. The first of these is initiation as an entered apprentice, for which the candidate receives a plain white apron. The aprons get more elaborate as members move through the Freemasonry's hierarchy, hence the extreme doctoring of the original picture. He even has a better moustache in the doctored version. But it's an interesting aside, but how did the young prince become involved in the lodge up in Yorkshire? Albert Victor Lodge had only 9 founding members. Several were members of the clergy, including the Reverend Arthur Purry Cust, Dean of York Minster, who would be the first master of the lodge. But the main driving force was Thomas Whitehead, the fine-looking man on the left. He'd been born in Yorkshire before travelling the world as a seaman, then journalist, returning home to edit the Yorkshire Gazette. An enthusiastic Freemason, he was a member of many lodges and orders, including the research lodge Cotra Coronati. It was Whitehead who persuaded Albert Victor, then stationed in York with the 10th Royal Hussars, not only to let the lodge use his name and coat of arms, but to sign the petition to Grand Lodge for permission to create the lodge in the first place. The young prince's name is the first on the list. The prince died in 1892, aged just 28, after catching flu. We don't know how the jewel came into the collection. His father, Edward VII's regalia, came to the museum at the beginning of the 20th century, and the jewel may be part of that donation. However it came, we're glad to have it. Treasure number 2 takes us back to the first half of the 18th century, not long after the formation of the first Grand Lodge in London. The treasure, part of the library's collection, is a small printed booklet titled A Speech Delivered to the Worshipful and Ancient Society of Free and Accepted Masons at a Grand Lodge held at Merchants' Hall in the city of York on St. John's Day, December the 27th, 1726. It's dedicated to Charles Bathurst, Esquire, Grand Master, and is credited to the Junior Grand Warden. The Grand Lodge is not the Grand Lodge of England based in London, it's the Grand Lodge of York, and the Junior Grand Warden and writer of this speech was Dr. Francis Drake, antiquary, surgeon, and Fellow of the Royal Society. Drake, pictured on the right, was also the author of a book called Eboracum, which was a famous history of the city of York. Eboracum was York's Roman name. The slide shows the title page of the second part of the book, which is about York Minster. The engraving is by John Pine, who was then the engraver of the official list of lodges for the Grand Lodge of England based in London. Drake joined an independent lodge in York in 1725. Evidence suggests the lodge existed from at least 1705, but may have even started meeting as early as 1693. Just after Drake joined, the lodge declared itself a Grand Lodge, but with no subordinate lodges, it wound up in 1734. It was revived as the Grand Lodge of All England by Drake and 5 colleagues in 1761, when the 2 London Grand Lodges of England started warranting more lodges in Yorkshire. Like the London Grand Lodges, York produced its own certificates, although theirs featured the crypt of York Minster. They saw themselves as a true competitor, warranting subordinate lodges and even establishing a 4th Grand Lodge, the Grand Lodge of England south of the River Trent in London. However, both York-affiliated Grand Lodges were short-lived. When the Grand Lodge of England warranted a lodge in York, now called York Lodge number 236, it drew members away from the local Grand Lodge, which elected its last Grand Master in 1792. Ironically, its minute books and surviving artefacts are now looked after by the very lodge that led to its downfall, York Lodge number 236. The oration itself was published in 1726. It's mostly a mythical history of Freemasonry, but it does contain one very significant passage, which reads, "For without running up to Cybillus or the Tower of Babel for proofs, the Temple of Belus of Lone or the Wars of Babylon, of both which the learned Dr. Perdue has given ample accounts, which were built 4,000 years ago, and above 1,000 before the building of Solomon's Temple, are sufficient testimonies, or at least give great reason to conjecture that 3 in parts of 4 of the whole earth might be divided into EP, FC, and MM. It's those initials that are important, representing entered prentice, fellow craft, and master mason. This is the first time that the 3rd degree of master mason appeared in print. Anderson's Constitutions of 1723 only mentions 2 degrees, entered apprentice and fellow craft, which was the norm at the formation of the first Grand Lodge. By the time the first ritual exposure, Masonry was dissected, was published in 1730, 3-degree ceremonies were common, but Drake was the first to mention them in print. The book came into the collection in 1939, one of many donations from the photographer Wallace Heaton, who features in my talk about Benjamin Franklin, which is now available to view on our website. Our 3rd treasure is even older than Drake's speech, and like the lodge in York, predates the formation of the Grand Lodge of England. It's called the William Watson manuscript. It's an 11-foot long parchment scroll dated 1687 by its scribe Edward Thompson, and headed with a naive drawing of the coat of arms of the London Company of Masons, later adopted as the coat of arms by the Grand Lodge of England. The manuscript is one of the old charges, a collective name given to over 120 manuscripts dating from the 14th to the 18th century. They nearly all contain a legendary history of the stonemason's craft, followed by a set of rules or charges for behaviour and practices within a stonemason's lodge. As you can see from this image of some of the old charges in our collection, they come in all shapes and sizes of parchment, scroll and manuscript books. They are a genuine link between modern Freemasonry and medieval stonemasonry. They played an important role in the shaping of organised Freemasonry, with James Anderson using several old charges to formulate the constitutions of the Freemasons published in 1723. Although several lodges owned old charges, they were largely forgotten about until the second half of the 19th century. Everything changed when the Freemason historian William James Hewan, pictured, published his book The Old Charges of British Freemasons in 1872, leading to old charges being discovered all over the country by Masonic scholars eager to explore links to medieval stonemasonry. It was then that Freemasons' libraries such as our own started collecting them seriously. This particular old charge was unearthed in 1890, and Mr. Walter Hamilton had been given the manuscript by his brother-in-law, who'd found it in an unopened safe in Roughside Hall, Northumberland. He approached Hewan and our librarian Henry Sadler, that's him on the right, with the view to sell. However, the manuscript was destined to remain in the north of England, when, to the surprise of both men, it was purchased by William Watson of Leeds, Yorkshire. An insurance broker from Headingley, Watson was also the honorary librarian of the Provincial Grand Lodge of Yorkshire West Riding. In 1890, its library was only 2 years old, but it had an influential and wealthy backer, Thomas Tew. He was an ex-railway engineer turned banker and provincial Grand Master of the province. He was a keen scholar of the history of Freemasonry, but had been frustrated by the lack of facilities in West Riding. His solution was to create one of the best Masonic libraries in 19th century England, and for a number of years His financial clout enabled Watson to outbid Grand Lodge's librarian Sadler on many important books and documents. By 1907, Watson had purchased 10 old charges for West Riding. At the same time, Grand Lodge's library only had 7. The manuscript's a really nice example of an old charge. Few have illustrated headers, and the handwriting is neat and legible. The fact that it is dated 1687 and signed by Edward Thompson is a bonus, although we don't yet know who Thompson was. You may also ask, why isn't it called the Thompson manuscript? For that, you have to blame Chew, who as purchaser named it after his friend. Sadly, the Yorkshire West Riding Library no longer exists, having lost its venue in the 1970s. Although the library was dispersed, the province made sure that the most important books and the old charges came into our care, and they still take an active role in their upkeep. Excuse me. At first glance, our fourth treasure doesn't look very Yorkshire. It's a past master's jewel for Armament Lodge number 3898, issued in 1943. The lodge was formed at the end of the First World War by Freemasons involved in the Ministry of Munitions and is based in London. Its members were mostly civil servants and engineers. However, the recipient of this jewel was Yorkshire cricketing legend Herbert Sutcliffe. As a cricketer, Sutcliffe should be more famous than he is. He opened the batting for Yorkshire and England in a career that lasted from 1919 until 1945. In 54 test matches for England, he scored 16 centuries with a batting average of 60, which is still the England record. He played over 600 matches for Yorkshire and was their first player to score over 100 first-class centuries and is still their all-time highest run scorer. He played for England when cricket's popularity was at its peak. This photograph, with Sutcliffe seated on the far left, is one of the England team for the 1932-33 tour of Australia, which was known as the Bodyline series because of England's effective but dangerous bowling tactics. 6 other players in this photograph were also Freemasons. Yorkshire teammates spinner Headley Verity and fast bowler Bill Bowes are in the middle row, as is the Sussex medium-pace bowler Maurice Tate. Bowes is the large man with glasses, and Verity is 2 paces to the left. Tate is 2 to the right. In the front row, 4 out of the 5 are Freemasons. Apart from Sutcliffe, team captain Douglas Jardine from Surrey is sat in the centre. And to the right, Middlesex fast bowler Gubby Allen and Gloucestershire batsman Wally Hammond. Hammond's Masonic apron pouch is on display in the museum, but as he didn't play for Yorkshire, I won't mention him again. The big question with Sutcliffe, apart from why isn't he more famous than Geoff Boycott, is why did he join a London lodge, not a Yorkshire one? His Yorkshire and England teammates Verity and Bowes were both members of the Lodge of Peace in Bradford. Sutcliffe was born and married in the town of Pudsey and played his early cricket for Pudsey in the Bradford League. Another famous teammate who later opened the batting with Sutcliffe, future England captain Sir Len Hutton, was initiated into Freemasonry in St Lawrence Lodge, Pudsey. For a man so welded to Yorkshire, even after he retired as a player, he ran a Yorkshire-based sports equipment business, was a Yorkshire committee member and a Yorkshire team selector, a London lodge defies logic. His initiation in Armament Lodge took place in 1926, when he was in the middle of his cricket career. But his choice of lodge may have nothing to do with cricket. It may derive from military service. Sutcliffe was about to sign for Yorkshire as a professional when the First World War broke out. In 1915, he was called up and joined the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, which specialised in the supply of equipment, weapons and munitions. His cricket career was delayed until his discharge in 1919, when he was 24 years old. At the beginning of the Second World War, as a reservist, he was called up to the Royal Army Ordnance Corps again, invalided out as a major in 1942. He was elected Master of Armament Lodge the following year. For this, he received 2 past master's jewels. The first, pictured on the right, was worn around his collar as the immediate past master of the lodge, and the second, which is our treasure, is a breast jewel that he was entitled to wear to any lodge meeting that he attended. Sutcliffe obviously enjoyed his Freemasonry, travelling down from Yorkshire to attend meetings, some of which coincided with county cricket matches. His third degree ceremony on the 21st of June 1926 took place on the same day that he scored 44 runs for Yorkshire against Middlesex at Lord's. He remained an active member of the lodge until his death in 1978. His jewels were donated to the collection by his daughter Barbara's family in the 1990s. As a former recreational player and current cricket fan myself, coming across Herbert Sutcliffe's jewels in our stores was one of the highlights of nearly 20 years in the museum. I was equally thrilled when I managed to purchase Wally Hammond's apron pouch a few years ago, who I wasn't going to mention again. Sutcliffe's past master's jewel concludes the talk. I chose 4 treasures from a shortlist of about a dozen, with Yorkshire well represented in the museum, its library and archives. The museum was created as a library in the 1830s, but since the appointment of Henry Sadler in the 1880s, successive librarians and curators have been building one of the great collections of willed Freemasonry. Given time and effort, I think we could produce a set of treasures with a tale to tell from just about anywhere in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Bravo, well done. Really, really interesting talk. If you have a question for Martin, please post it in the chat. There's one I would like to answer just right away. I got one saying, when will the museum be back open again? And I have to say, we sadly don't know. We don't have a date yet for it. We hope, of course, it will be sooner rather than later, but there are obviously lots of safety measures we have to get in place first. But we will get a date out as soon as we know, of course. Martin, I seem to have a bit of an invitation for you in the chat. Let's start with that one. Would you like to come to Tapton Hall in order to see some of our magnificent treasures from the other Yorkshire province, that of Yorkshire West Riding?
I would. I'd love to come to Tapton Hall. It's one of the Masonic centres I would like to visit, because they have got a very impressive library, I've heard. So.
Yes. Oh, very good. Thank you very much for that question.
Thank you.
Martin, let's go back to the first treasure you mentioned was one of the jewels. I mean, some of these seem incredibly valuable, clearly fit for a royal. Can you tell us a bit more about these precious jewels?
Well, founders' jewels are usually given to people who found a lodge. They can be elaborate, they can be quite simple. They tended to be quite elaborate in the Victorian period because it was one of those very prestigious things to found, and Freemasons could wear quite a lot of jewels during that period. This one, although it was produced to give to a royal prince as a gift, so I think the lodge spent a lot of money on it. Usually the founders all chip in and buy their own founders' jewels, but I guess they were so pleased that they'd managed to get a prince to be the founder of their lodge and let them use his name and coat of arms, that they obviously gifted him this jewel. Although we've got another jewel almost identical to that in the collection, which is also 18-karat gold, and has also got the enamel white roses of York on the fretwork instead of a ribbon, which belonged to another founder of the lodge who was a vicar. It looks like he was given, normally every founder gets a founder's jewel, but I think with this lodge they decided only to give they gave certain founders the jewel as a gift. So yeah, so they more than one expert. They can be very different, founders' jewels. They can be quite simple, but these ones seem particularly elaborate. But all the Edward VII, we got a lot of regalia from his collection because he was involved with a lot of lodges and Masonic orders, and all of his seemed very fancy. Mm-hmm. So I guess it was that, and most of them seem to be gifted him. So I guess it was that it's impressive raw. So and the Duke of Clarence was his son, so it's. And a possible future King of England. Sadly, didn't make it because he died when he was only 28. But yeah, I think that's where that comes from.
That's where that comes from. Fantastic. Just in relation to that, Martin, there's a question in the chat. Did he give his name to any other lodges during his short life?
I don't know. I'll have to check. It's quite common to name lodges after royals, but I don't know, but there are means of checking. On our website, there's a link to a site called Lane's Masonic Records, and you can basically it's a record of all the lodges that existed under the various Grand Lodges of England, where they met and things, and you can search for names. If you put in Clarence, you might find some other Duke of Clarence lodges.
It's a good tip. Martin, the photograph you showed of the aprons, that was very intriguing. Can you tell us a bit more about these photos of aprons? And also you mentioned there were different levels of aprons, is that right?
Yeah, so when you join Freemasonry, you start off as an entered apprentice, and you get the most simple white apron, which is the aprons are supposedly based on the aprons that stonemasons would have worn. So it's like a work, but they're obviously stylized and smaller than a stonemason's apron. And it would have been a plain white lambskin apron. And as you move through the different degrees, so there's 3 degrees, the aprons become more elaborate. So you get a border and some sort of tassels and things added to it. And then when you work up through the hierarchy of Freemasonry, so through provincial Grand Lodges and Grand Lodges, you get ever more and more elaborate aprons with different symbols on to represent your rank within those Grand Lodges. And obviously when that photograph was originally taken in Brighton in 1886, Clarence only just joined Freemasonry, so they stood with his uncle and his father, and he's wearing this plain white apron. So at some point they wanted a picture of the 3 Royal Freemasons together, and they said, well, we've got this one. And someone very skillfully added his regalia to that photograph, and gave him a much better moustache, which was equally impressive.
All right, that's really good. In connection with your point about the first mention, there was a reference on the manuscript where you were showing 3 parts of 4. Is that right? What was the 4th?
Do you know, I've no idea. That most of it might be because I'm not a Freemason, but I think most of Drake's speech makes little sense. I'm sure it did to people at the time, and maybe it's my own ignorance, but a lot of you just really think, oh, this is absolute nonsense. And it's all sort of talk about antiquity and myths and legends and famous historic buildings. And I'm sure it may make sense to Freemasons, but as a non-Mason, it doesn't make any sense to me at all. But those initials at the bottom were the bit that was crucial, because that has been documented as the first mention of the Master Mason degree. Because initially you only had 2 degrees. There was entered apprentice and fellow crafts, and the Masters of Lodges, but there wasn't a 3rd degree. So this 3rd degree was a sort of later innovation.
I see, right. Can you explain what the 3 levels rosettes mean on aprons, and what they distinguish between?
The 3
levels on the apron. I refer to this is probably more of an inquiry for our curator, because he's more of an object person than me. But if someone wants to if someone wants to email the library museums, we can have a go at answering that. But no. That's fair enough. Martin, I think let's talk a bit about because the thing about sport lodges is quite interesting. Were there any other sport lodges?
Yeah. So I mean, none of the Yorkshire cricketers were in. In fact, none of the cricketers in that photograph were in lodges particularly for sportsmen. But there was a sports lodge. Well, there was a cricket lodge called Kennington Lodge that was started in the 19th century, which was based at the Kennington Oval, which is a cricket ground in South London, and actually met in the tavern in the Oval. Sports lodges in those days were quite rare, but there seem to be more of them now. So there's another cricket lodge, there's one called the Lodge of Grace in Gloucestershire. There's at least one football lodge. There's several rugby union lodges in Wales. And I think there's one in the West Country, and then maybe a rugby league lodge up north. There's a motor racing lodge, but they're quite nice. So you get lodges for people who've got a shared interest. But it's interesting that none of the cricketers tends to belong to cricket lodges. They all belong to very different lodges. So that photograph of that England team, the all the workhorses in the team, so like the fast bowlers and the bowlers, they were mostly from the north of England or the Midlands, and they tend to belong to lodges that reflected that. Whereas the batsman and things like the captain Douglas Jardine, he went to Oxford, he went to public school, so he was a member of Apollo University Lodge in Oxford, but he was also in a lodge that was related to his school. And Gubby Allen, who was sat next to him, also had a very similar background, and he was a member of his school lodge as well. Whereas the Yorkshire members of the team were very much in local, sort of more like working class, middle class lodges. And so it's quite interesting. It sort of reflects society.
You mentioned the cricket tour there, Martin. Why was it called? Did you say it was called the Body Line Tour?
Yeah. So in that period, the greatest cricketer who ever existed was an Australian batsman called Don Bradman, later Sir Don Bradman. And I mean, his average in Test cricket is 99 points. And so nearly every time he batted, he got 100 runs. So it was really difficult to get him out. And the last time they played Australia, they just didn't get Bradman out, and he just kept scoring. So they devised this tactic of bowling at him to get him out. So to make him give catches, so rather bowling at the stumps or trying to get catches, they basically bowled the ball to bounce and almost hit him. But it worked really well, and they used it for other players as well. But it did make the team really unpopular. So when they toured Australia, the crowd were booing them, and there was all the Australian press was sounded disgraceful, because quite a few of the cricketers got really badly hurt by it. Because in those days, cricketers didn't wear helmets, their padding and gloves were much flimsier than they are nowadays. But I think the players were quite friendly, because quite a few of the Australians were Freemasons as well. So Bradman himself was a Freemason. And
good. I was just about to ask, actually. That was a question in the chat, if there were any Australian cricketers.
So the Australian wicketkeeper was a Freemason. I think it's called Bert Oldfield, and their captain Bill Ponstead was as well. In fact, Oldfield in one of the matches was hit in the head and almost knocked unconscious, and the crowd were baying for blood. And Jardine, the captain, was really, really unpopular, and everywhere he went, he was getting hounded by people. And despite being hit on the head, because of Jardine's tactics, Oldfield actually asked Jardine to come to a Masonic meeting in Australia with him to get him away from the sort of violence and of the Australian crowds. So I think that the Freemasons amongst them, there's quite a lot of mutual respect. But but it was a very interesting tour, and it changed the rules of cricket afterwards. They had to change the rules so the England's tactics couldn't be used again. But it was an interesting series.
That is brilliant. That is very interesting. We're going to have to do a separate talk on cricket, Martin. Definitely.
4 hours on cricket.
That's fantastic. Martin, just returning to what you said about names of lodges, really, there are some quite strange names. But why the name south of the River Trent Lodge?
Oh, yeah, that was a weird one, because obviously the Grand Lodge of All England was in York, which was the York Grand Lodge. Some members of a London lodge, the Lodge of Antiquity, which is one of the really old lodges that founded the first Grand Lodge of England in London, they got into a row with Grand Lodge, and they broke away, and they decided to form their own Grand Lodge. But rather than just go ahead and forming one, they asked the York Grand Lodge for permission to start this new lodge. And they said, yeah, you can be we're the Grand Lodge of All England, because they're based in York. You could be the Grand Lodge of All England south of the River Trent, which the River Trent's in Nottingham. So obviously they've given them quite a large area to play in, which is modern Nottingham's sort of in the Midlands in England, if you're not familiar with English geography. And it only ever had 2 lodges, and they were both based in London. And it didn't last for long, because eventually the members of the Lodge of Antiquity who'd broken away came back into the fold of the London Grand Lodge. So it was a very short Grand Lodge. But the south of the River Trent's a really weird title for a London Grand Lodge.
That's very interesting, actually, but yes, strange. Martin, there is an interesting one here. As a member of St. Lawrence Lodge, Pudsey, we have Len Hutton's apron and case. I wonder if the museum would be a good place for it to live.
Oh, you'd have to ask the curator. And obviously it was down to me, yes.
Okay, very good.
Yeah. And
Very,
it's a nice thing about him is he was a really enthusiastic Freemason. Some of the others, like Wally Hammond, we got his apron pouch in a sale. It's about 3 or 4 years ago, possibly a bit longer than that. But when that came up, we didn't quite believe it because he was a member of a Nottinghamshire lodge, but he played all his cricket in Gloucestershire, and which is quite a long way from Nottingham.
yes.
And he wasn't in this lodge very long, but we thought we'll check. We found in the membership register that it definitely was him because it said Walter Hammond, professional cricketer. But then we thought, why did he join this lodge? And we did a bit of digging and we looked at the lodge had actually been founded by his father-in-law. So he'd obviously joined the lodge to get in
Yes.
with the father-in-law, but his marriage didn't last very long, and nor did his membership of the lodge.
Oh.
So he was nice to have his apron pouch, but Len Hutton's would be brilliant because Len Hutton was a fantastic cricketer and meant to be a really nice man, and he was the first professional to captain England cricket team because in the old days it was the sort of posh amateurs who captained the England cricket team, so people like Jardine who went to public school, I think, whereas Len Hutton was sort of the Earth Yorkshireman, so
Yeah.
he was in there on his own merit, and that's why he was captain because he was the best cricketer.
Oh, that very good to know. Thank you for letting us know about that, about the apron and the case. Martin, you've talked about the Museum of Freemasonry's Yorkshire treasures here, or a few of them. What treasures still exist in Yorkshire?
Well, there's probably quite a lot of stuff because there's obviously the York Lodge, which owns all the archives of that York Grand Lodge. So they've got minute books and I guess certificates and possibly some regalia, which is great. There are other Masonic libraries, and although the Yorkshire West Riding Library was closed in the 1970s, there is stuff in East and North and East Ridings, and individual lodges own stuff. I mean, one of the nice things about Freemasonry is lodges own things, and now and again you get really surprised by what they own. Or you go into a Masonic centre and you walk into their temple and they've just got this fantastic piece of furniture or a piece of art on their wall or an item that belonged to somebody well known, but no one knows about it but them, and that's really nice.
Yes.
Especially when you find it.
Yes, oh goodness me, yes. Interesting. Martin, are there any other sort of archives or research resources that you want to mention where people can go and find out more?
There's all sorts of things. I mean, obviously our catalogues are always worth searching for. Our catalogue's available via the website, and you can, anywhere you're in the world that you're interested in, put in our name. In the name of that place on the catalogue, and you can see what. And the nice thing about our catalogue, we've got museum objects, library books, archival items, documents, letters. They're all on the catalogue. We don't have a separate catalogue for each collection. So if you're interested in something, it's quite serendipitous. So you can be going in looking for a book, but then you find out you've got an object related to that thing that you're looking for as well. So that's good. A lot of some of the bigger Masonic libraries around the country have online catalogues. I know Worcester have. Always worth having a look to see what they've got. The research for this inquiry, I mean, for this paper, some of the stuff that I got on Hammond, I got off of, there's a website called Cricinfo, which is a sort of cricket statistic thing. And that's how I was able to work out that Sutcliffe had played for Yorkshire the day that he went through his third degree, because we've got the membership register, so it shows exactly when he did the Masonic stuff. But then Cricinfo's got all the fixture lists and season records for going back, to the Victorian era. So I was able to look at the county championships for 1926 and see when Yorkshire were playing in London. I thought now they're playing Middlesex in whenever, I think it was June. That coincides with the lodge meeting, and then you can actually work out when they were playing at which point. So I could see that he got 44 runs on the day that he was.
Oh, fantastic!
What I'd like to know is, did he have his Masonic regalia in his cricket bag when he was at the ground? And did he go straight there afterwards in his cricket whites?
Fantastic. A great piece of research. Yeah. Martin, let's end with this one. I'm afraid time is running. I know there are lots of really great Yorkshire treasures in the collection, but is there anyone you didn't have time to mention today that you just want to mention before we end?
Yeah, when I originally gave this talk, I had a lot longer, and it was given I mean, obviously I had to travel all the way up to Yorkshire to give it, so I think I had an hour. And one of the treasures I talked about was a letter of complaint, and it's quite nice to end with a letter of complaint. And basically, it was one of the original Grand Lodges, the Ancients Grand Lodge, had a group of Freemasons called the Nine Worthies, who went around to check other lodges to make sure they were doing their ritual right. So a bit like a ritual police. And they had a special jewel and had a warrant from Grand Lodge to say what they were. And one of the lodges from Yorkshire wrote that they'd had a visit from someone who claimed to be a Nine Worthy, and he basically abused his hospitality and annoyed the members of the lodge. And Grand Lodge wrote back to him saying, this man was a Nine Worthy, but hasn't been for 2 years. So obviously he was still resting on his past position to put himself into lodges and to sort of bully them, and yeah, so that was quite interesting, but I just didn't have time. There's too many treasures.
No, it was a long time. Oh, fantastic. Oh, goodness. We talked for a long time about this, Martin. Thank you so much. We are running out of time, I'm afraid. I want to say thank you so much to Martin for a fantastic talk. Thank you to Louise, our technical wizard. And of course, thank you to all of you for joining us and for your questions. I hope you will join us again. We will be back on Monday, the 10th of August at 7:30 p.m. British time with Mark Dennis, our curator at the Museum of Freemasonry. Throughout history, conflict and times of war have created some of the most unique pieces of art, and Mark will explore this special art form born out of conflict with us on the 10th of August. Please join us. It will be a very interesting evening. The link to register is already available on our website. If you haven't done so already, you can also sign up for our newsletter. Please visit the Museum of Freemasonry's website, where you can find much more information about our exciting work. For now, thank you so much and have a nice evening.
Thank you.